Property is theft. These three words shook 19th century Europe and changed revolutionary thought forever. A man from poverty, wearing wooden shoes, challenged the entire capitalist system. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was the first to call himself an anarchist and dreamed of a world without a state, where workers would control their own labor. He clashed with Marx in a legendary confrontation that split socialism for 150 years. His ideas inspired revolutions and cooperatives, but his personal prejudices cast a shadow over his legacy. Who was this controversial thinker? A genius or a utopian? A liberator or a fanatic? Today, we will reveal all sides of Proudhon, from his brilliant insights to the dark spots in history. Make yourself comfortable, my dear viewer. We are about to begin. Part 1. The Birth of a Philosophy. To really grasp Proudhon's radical ideas, you've got to understand the world he grew up in. France in the 1800s was a whirlwind of change. The Revolution of 1789 had destroyed the old feudal system, but what to replace it with was still up for debate. By the time Proudhon was growing up in the 1820s and 30s, France was flip-flopping between monarchy, republic, and empire. The Industrial Revolution was starting, attracting peasants to factories and creating a whole new urban working class. The traditional craftsmen who once powered medieval production suddenly found themselves losing ground to machines and factory competition. Wealth flowed into the hands of new capitalists while workers faced staggering poverty. This chaotic scene influenced Proudhon's thinking. Unlike the armchair socialists who talked about workers from their plush seats, Proudhon knew poverty firsthand. He had lived it, felt it in every step of his worn-out wooden shoes as a kid. He saw the rapidly changing industrial world not as advancement, but as a fresh form of exploitation taking over from the old ways. In 1840, Proudhon penned his first major book, What is Property? Or An Inquiry into the Principle of Right and Government, beginning with a line that launched him into fame and controversy. Property is theft. This statement needs some unpacking because Proudhon didn't mean what most people assume. He wasn't claiming all ownership is wrong or that individuals shouldn't have any control over resources. His argument was more layered, targeting a specific issue he thought was devastating society. Proudhon made a crucial distinction between two types of ownership lumped together in French and many economic theories under the word property. The first he called possession, and the second property in its pure sense. To Proudhon, possession meant legitimately using resources you occupy and use physically. If you lived in a house, farmed the land, or used tools for work, you possessed these items. Your possession was justified through use. These resources were essential for your life and work. Proudhon supported possession and actively fought for it. But property was a whole different beast, and a more sinister one in his eyes. Property was the legal right to exclude others from resources and profit from them without utilizing them yourself. It was the landlord's right to collect rent while living on the other side of town, the factory owner's right to rake in profits without lifting a finger, and the banker's right to earn interest on loans. This kind of property let some folks live off others' labor as if they were parasites. When Proudhon declared property is theft, he was specifically targeting this second form. In his view, a landlord collecting rent was essentially taking a slice of what the tenant earned through their work. A factory owner who paid workers only a part of what their labor produced was pocketing the extra value they created. A banker charging interest was taking from borrowers. In each scenario, someone who didn't add to the labor took away value from those who did. While the ideas share some similarities with Marx's theories, Proudhon developed these concepts independently, following his own path. For Proudhon, it was really a question of fairness and natural rights rather than historical materialism. He believed labor was the only legitimate foundation for ownership. If you worked on something and transformed it through your effort, you had a rightful claim to use it. But when you claimed ownership beyond what you used and worked on, you crossed a line. Just think about it. If a farmer worked 50 acres with his family, he had rightful possession because he was actively using the land. But a landlord with 5,000 acres who rented out plots wasn't working the land. He was just collecting money from those who did. His legal ownership allowed him to benefit from others' labor without contributing any work himself. Proudhon argued this was essentially theft, hidden beneath the law's cover. This analysis really stirred the pot. Proudhon went straight for the jugular of the capitalist system and the laws holding it up. Things like rent, profit, and interest, basically money made without much effort, were, in his view, just fancy versions of theft. The whole deal with wage labor, where workers trade their skills and time to bosses who own the places they work, was another way of squeezing folks dry. But Proudhon's views weren't simplistic. He didn't side with the communists who wanted to scrap private ownership altogether in favor of collective ownership. He saw that as a road to another form of tyranny. With the state owning everything, individuals would be shackled by government rules and lose their freedom. State-backed collective ownership was just trading one type of exploitation for another. So, Proudhon suggested a different approach: possession instead of property. People should just have what they actually need, like their homes, tools, or farms. No one should own what they don't use. As for factories, workers running them should call the shots, forming what he referred to as labor associations. These would be cooperative organizations where workers make joint decisions and share the fruits of their labor. This reflects Proudhon's main philosophy, mutualism, a notion he got from interacting with French workers, especially those in Lyon during the 1840s. These workers had developed ideas about mutual aid and barter systems, which Proudhon transformed into a comprehensive economic theory. At the heart of mutualism is the belief that economic transactions should be fair and benefit everyone involved, not just serve as a money grab. Artisans, farmers, and worker co-ops would trade based on the hours worked. If a shoemaker puts 10 hours into making boots and a carpenter does the same on a chair, they'd swap goods equally. Sure, this might seem a bit dreamy, and Marx criticized this part of Proudhon's theory. But Proudhon wasn't out to lunch. He recognized that different skills had different values, and that market dynamics impacted trades. His main concern was ensuring exchanges stayed fair without being skewed by property-driven power. Proudhon's mutualism skillfully balances personal freedom with group collaboration. He wanted folks to govern their work lives, maintaining their independence. Yet he also understood that people excel through teamwork and that modern production requires serious collaboration. Mutualism aims for a collective harmony through voluntary cooperation, steering clear of the employer-employee dynamic in capitalism or mandates from the state. A major piece of this vision was his idea for a people's bank. This institution would provide interest-free loans to workers and entrepreneurs, only asking for a small handling fee. It's crucial to understand the reasoning here. In capitalism, those with money can lend it at interest, earning more just by having wealth. This gives immense power to the rich and forces workers and small business owners to pay just to access the tools they need. Proudhon argued that charging interest on loans is unfounded and is like paying for nothing. When banks lend money, they aren't actually sacrificing anything. They're just creating credit that gets settled. The borrower repays more than they borrowed, allowing lenders to profit without real work or risk once securities are in place. Proudhon believed that by eliminating interest, he could break the hold of finance capital and help workers gain fair access to resources. In 1849, he even attempted to create such a bank based on his mutual credit ideas. Efforts to raise funds via donations fell through because the bank was underfunded, and Proudhon ended up in prison for 3 years due to his rebellious writings. However, this setback taught important lessons about the practical challenges in his plans, which only became more apparent over time. Proudhon's ideas about the state were pretty influential. By calling himself an anarchist, he wasn't aiming for chaos. He saw government as unjust and believed political power needed to be dismantled. In his 1849 book, The Confessions of a Revolutionary, he famously said, "Anarchy is order without power." This sums up the idea that true order can exist without hierarchy or force, and that people can handle things through voluntary agreements and associations. For him, the real issue wasn't the absence of government, but rather the presence of exploitation and domination. Proudhon believed the state mainly existed to protect property in an exploitative manner. He thought laws were made to favor landlords, capitalists, and creditors, often at the expense of workers and the poor. According to him, law enforcement and the military were used to suppress any pushback against exploitation, with every government department propping up an unjust system. Yet, unlike some later anarchists, Proudhon wasn't pushing for a violent revolution. Instead, he supported peaceful economic reform. He imagined a world where, as workers set up cooperatives and mutual credit systems while building networks of free communes, the need for a state would disappear. With no economic foundation and without support from a productive society, the government would just naturally become obsolete. Proudhon proposed a federated society, self-managed through voluntary associations. Communities, or communes, would govern themselves using direct democracy and could choose to collaborate with others for broader coordination while always having the option to opt out. Instead of a centralized power, everything would run on agreements that everyone respected. Part 2. The Dialectical Method and Economic Contradictions. To really understand Proudhon's philosophy, you can't just focus on his final thoughts. You have to explore how he got there and the method he used. In 1846, Proudhon released his most ambitious theoretical work, The System of Economic Contradictions, or The Philosophy of Poverty. This 2-volume project aimed to overhaul economic science by examining capitalism's inherent contradictions through a dialectic perspective. Proudhon was heavily influenced by the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, although he absorbed Hegel's ideas through French sources and never learned German. From Hegel, he adopted the dialectical method, which involves uncovering truth through the conflict and merging of opposing forces. However, Proudhon added his twist by applying it to economics instead of just philosophy. The dialectical approach kicks off with the idea that reality is loaded with contradictions and opposing forces that drive conflict and change. These contradictions aren't just logical errors to correct. They're fundamental to how things operate. A thesis triggers an antithesis, and from their clash comes a synthesis that incorporates and transcends them. Proudhon believed that political economy, or the study of how societies produce and distribute goods, was filled with such contradictions. Every economic institution and supposedly natural or essential principle was riddled with an opposing principle that contradicted it. These weren't mere philosophical conundrums. They were actual tensions, causing social misery, economic crises, and class conflict. Take the division of labor, a foundational aspect of modern industrial production. Adam Smith praised the division of labor for its efficiency. By breaking complex tasks into simple, repetitive ones done by specialized workers, production could soar. Smith's pin factory example showed how 10 workers, each handling a small task, could produce way more pins than 10 workers making whole pins individually. Proudhon recognized this productivity boost. The division of labor marked a significant advancement, a powerhouse for modern industry. But here's the catch. This same division also held a destructive element. Breaking work into monotonous tasks turns the worker into just a cog in the machine. The craftsman who once used skill and creativity to make whole products is now stuck doing the same repetitive task repeatedly. His knowledge diminishes, his skills wane, and his humanity suffers. He becomes, as Marx would later call it, alienated, disconnected from the broader meaning and outcome of his labor. Moreover, division of labor creates dependence. A worker performing only one task cannot function alone. He relies on the entire production process, making him dependent on those who control it. The factory owner gains significant power over workers because the system makes them incapable of working independently. So, the same process that increases productivity also heightens exploitation and control. This is what Proudhon referred to as economic contradiction. The division of labor boosts productivity, but also serves as a source of oppression. You can't simply discard it and return to crafting days, as that would mean sacrificing the wealth it generates. But fully embracing it grinds down human dignity and consolidates power. This contradiction demands resolution on a higher level through a new organization style that preserves productivity while eliminating domination. Proudhon applied this dialectical critique to every critical part of political economy. Take machinery, for example. Machines enhance our ability to produce and reduce physical labor, which is positive. But within a capitalist system, they become instruments against workers. Machines displace human workers, leading to unemployment. They despise the 9-to-5 grind, leading to smaller paychecks. They're okay with letting employers streamline the workforce, making it simpler to keep everyone in line. Workers find themselves at odds with technology, forced to put up with terrible conditions or risk getting replaced. This competitive nature is kind of ironic. Supposedly, free competition, which is the backbone of liberal economic thought, ensures that businesses stay efficient and give consumers the best bang for their buck. When companies are in a race, they must innovate, slash expenses, and cater to customers to stay afloat. This pushes the economy forward. But here's the twist. Competition can also lead to monopolies. The top dogs in the market either take down or absorb smaller businesses, concentrating economic influence in their hands. So, competition doubles back on itself, morphing into something else entirely. Credit and cash have their own quirks, too. Credit makes big ideas happen that wouldn't see the light of day otherwise, helping folks start companies or fund farms. Yet, it also opens the door to usury, where the wealthy pocket interest from those in need. Money is a jack of all trades, facilitating complex trades and transactions. But it also turns into something to hoard or gamble with, becoming more about power than actual productivity. Even the concept of value, a cornerstone for Proudhon, is riddled with contradictions. Products have use value, their actual usefulness, and exchange value, their worth in trade. These different values often butt heads. Useful stuff like water might not cost much because it's everywhere, while something like diamonds, which aren't as essential, fetch a high price because they're rare. Labor creates use value, but exchange value depends on broader market forces out of any worker's grasp. Proudhon used this dialectical method to figure out that capitalism itself is a complex beast. Every principle in traditional political economics carries its contradiction. Every foundational institution within capitalism breeds contradictions that result in crises and suffering. These problems can't just be fixed with small tweaks or hopes that the market will magically right itself. They're deeply rooted in the system's DNA. Here's where Proudhon's views took a different path from Marx's trajectory. Marx saw these contradictions deepening, causing a revolutionary upheaval that would usher in socialism. The working class, pushed to breaking point by worsening conditions and driven together in factories, would rise up to overthrow the ruling class and seize control of production. But Proudhon didn't buy into the idea of a dramatic revolutionary meltdown. He didn't think these contradictions would resolve themselves through violent upheavals. Instead, he envisioned a conscious transcendence of these contradictions by creating new economic systems. These systems would blend the positives from what exists while ditching the negatives. This could be achieved through mutualism. Take a second look at property using this lens. Capitalist private property results in exploitation and unfairness. That's the negative or antithesis. But state-controlled collective property isn't without flaws either, as it squashes personal freedom and creates another form of oppression. The solution, Proudhon argued, is possession, a form of ownership based on use and occupation that keeps personal control without enabling exploitation. When it comes to economic coordination, free markets are flexible and able to adapt to changing needs, but can also lead to chaos, downturns, and wealth gaps. Central planning helps coordinate production, but relies on a strong state and stifles creativity. The mutualist alternative is federative association, where independent producers voluntarily cooperate through agreements and mutual banks, sidestepping both cutthroat competition and heavy-handed state control. Throughout his writings on economic contradictions, Proudhon dove into these dialectical explorations, analyzing how each economic category contains opposing forces in need of synthesis. The content is intense, can get repetitive, and is often quite complex. Even supporters find it a tough nut to crack. So, let's get into a big issue with Proudhon's way of seeing things through a dialectical lens, something Marx didn't hold back on criticizing. Proudhon treated economic concepts like they existed in a vacuum, ignoring their roots in human history. He saw competition, machines, and credit as timeless entities to be studied on their own, without considering the social settings that birthed them. Marx flagged this as a major blunder, a slip into idealism that missed the crucial material aspects of economic study. Economic concepts aren't just floating ideas. They stem from how humans interact at different periods in time. Private property doesn't just exist because of some logical necessity. It's here because certain people took resources and used power to keep that control. Wage labor isn't some natural state. It emerged historically when peasants without land had to sell their work to survive. By treating these economic ideas as abstract subjects for dialectic analysis, Proudhon missed the real-life class battles and historical changes that shape economic systems. His approach often ended up as more of an intellectual game, resulting in theories that might look good on paper, but failed to connect with the real forces driving society. Plus, Proudhon's faith in problem-solving through peaceful means like mutual credit and voluntary groups underestimated the lengths privileged groups would go to protect their interests. He thought workers could just set up new systems like cooperatives and mutual banks to gradually outperform capitalist structures. But he didn't fully reckon with how capitalists might use their influence over government, legal systems, and resources to crush these efforts. The collapse of the People's Bank was a glaring proof of this shortfall. Proudhon couldn't gather enough funds through voluntary contributions because the workers simply couldn't pitch in a lot, and those with wealth had zero interest in backing something that threatened their dominance. Far from being neutral, the state actively opposed Proudhon by jailing him and shutting down his writings. Despite these mistakes, Proudhon still had some valuable insights. He nailed it when pointing out that capitalism has built-in contradictions that can't be solved just by tinkering with the system. The clash between collective effort and personal ownership, between social production and private property, and the potential of technology versus its manipulative use, are still pressing issues today. Proudhon also had the foresight to see that for socialism to really work, it needs to mesh individual freedom with community coordination. The old tug-of-war between personal ownership and government control, between free markets and planned economies, between individualism and collectivism, has been a thorn in socialist thinking for eons. By advocating for a third option, Proudhon opened debates that continue to engage socialists. His emphasis on federalism and voluntary associations as alternatives to both capitalist markets and state socialism has shaped anarchist and syndicalist thoughts for a long time. The idea that workers could manage production themselves through democratic cooperatives linked by federations instead of depending on markets or central planning remains a core anarchist belief. Although Proudhon's ideas like labor time tickets and mutual credit didn't succeed, the overarching vision of worker self-management still resonates. His take on economic contradictions shows his ambitious yet flawed perspective, highlighting both his keen understanding of capitalism's faults and his weaknesses in finding practical solutions. Marx's sharp critique in The Poverty of Philosophy pointed out many of these flaws and helped define the major split between anarchist and Marxist versions of socialism. Part 3. The Federative Principle. Proudhon wasn't just about pointing out problems with economic systems. He had a vision for building something better, too. His idea of a federative principle imagined a society without centralized power or capitalism, and it might just be his most lasting legacy in the world of political thought. Today, when folks think of federalism, they're usually picturing something like the U.S., where government power is split between national and state levels. But Proudhon's take was much more radical. He dreamed of a federalism without government, where society naturally organizes through voluntary agreements among individuals and groups, with no single authority calling the shots. Let's break it down, starting with the individual worker. In Proudhon's utopia, everyone owns the tools they need for their craft. A shoemaker has his shop and tools, a farmer owns his land and equipment, and a writer has their books and work desk. These possessions are theirs because they're part of everyday work, not because of legal papers that might allow someone else to claim ownership. But here's the thing. Nobody works completely solo. Making stuff is a group effort. The shoemaker needs leather from the tanner, thread from the spinner, and food from the farmer. Complex goods require lots of specialized people working together. Proudhon understood this big need for collaboration in modern production. So, people form groups to support one another. Think of factory workers creating what we call a worker coup today. Instead of one boss pocketing all the profits, the workers jointly own the business and make decisions through voting. They elect managers who work for them, figure out what to produce, and lay out work plans. Earnings are shared based on agreed rules. These co-ops run on genuine democracy. Each worker gets one vote. Big decisions are made in general meetings where everyone can have their say. Day-to-day tasks might go to elected managers or committees, but they always have to answer to the group and can be replaced if necessary. It's simple. The people doing the work get to make the rules. These smaller groups then work together. The textile co-op needs cotton from farm co-ops, machinery from metalworks, and transport from shipping co-ops. In capitalism, markets and prices manage these things, with investors steering resources to make profits. In state socialism, central committees plan everything, dictating production from above. Proudhon wasn't a fan of either approach. He saw markets as unfair and chaotic. Central planning made for a powerful government, which could turn tyrannical. Instead, he proposed using contracts and federations. Groups would strike deals, outlining who provides what, with both parties agreeing and renewing terms regularly. No need for state enforcement. These would rely on shared interests and reputation. If a group broke its contract, others would avoid it, just like in regular business, where trust is key. Without the unevenness of private property and wage labor, these contracts would feel truly fair and cooperative, not forced. On a larger scale, co-ops would connect to form federations by region or industry to tackle bigger projects. Textile co-ops in the same area might link up to share know-how, coordinate efforts, and negotiate with suppliers. Crucially, though, the federation wouldn't control its members. Every co-op maintains its independence, and if they don't like the deal, they can walk away. The same idea applies to local communities. Imagine Proudhon's communes as self-governing small communities, be it a village, city neighborhood, or district, depending on what suits best locally. These communes would manage local resources, regulate production and consumption, maintain infrastructure, and resolve disputes. But they wouldn't act like mini-states with the power to enforce rules. Instead, membership between people and the commune is more like a contract. Folks choose to join and can leave when they wish. The commune only handles matters they're allowed to. So, it all hinges on people willingly cooperating and reaching agreements. These communes would also band together with others for larger aims. A cluster of communes might collaborate on a river project, road networks, or industries. These smaller, local gatherings could then connect on a national or even global scale to work on things like research, building projects, or defense efforts. The main idea is clear. The individual groups are more important than the overseeing federation. Power flows from the bottom up, not top down. No federation should dictate to its members. They're just there to help achieve shared goals, and if they fail at that, they can be reformed or dismantled. This way of organizing is entirely different from a state, which claims complete control over its citizens. States create and enforce laws, collect taxes regardless of consent, and maintain a monopoly on force through police and military. You can't just opt out. You're governed whether you like it or not. Proudhon's model of federalism discards the notion of sovereignty entirely. There's no head honcho. Power is distributed, limited, and can be revoked based on everyone's willingness to be part of the system. It's a kind of anarchy, not in the sense of chaos, but in having no rulers. It's all about people freely cooperating and respecting one another. Think about how disagreements might get resolved in this setup. If two cooperatives disagree on something, they have to work it out between them. If that fails, they could ask a third party to mediate. But this mediator can't impose a solution. Both sides must agree for any decision to take effect. While it might seem like a setup for endless squabbling, Proudhon believed it was quite the opposite. Since both sides must find common ground, since neither can force the other, it drives them to reach fair agreements. A cooperative that gains a reputation for being unreasonable will soon find itself isolated. This system promotes good behavior naturally, without being heavy-handed. A big part of this idea is Proudhon's concept of a people's bank with mutual credit. Workers need funds to start cooperatives and stand against big companies. Regular banks only lend if there's something to back it up and charge interest, keeping capital in the hands of owners, not workers. Proudhon's People's Bank would switch things up. It would be owned by the workers and co-ops using it, and it would only charge enough to cover its costs instead of interest. Credit would be based on the borrower's productivity and reliability, not based on collateral. The bank's credit would be supported by the overall productivity of its members. Here's the basic idea. Money today is mostly credit or promises to pay that looks like real wealth. Banks create more credit when they lend out money, which boosts the money supply. Proudhon believed credit should empower producers instead of enriching bankers with interest. So, if a cooperative needed funds for equipment, they'd visit a mutual bank. The bank would assess if the equipment would improve output and if the coup was reliable. If all checked out, they'd receive credit without interest. This ensures workers keep the fruits of their labor instead of funneling profits to financiers. Proudhon saw this as a way for workers to gradually build capital and start cooperatives without needing to exploit others. As more workers joined coups and used mutual credit, capitalist businesses would struggle to compete. Why would workers choose traditional jobs when they could run a cooperative and reap all the benefits? Change would happen quietly through marketplace shifts rather than political revolutions. The state's control would diminish as cooperatives grew economically, making the state less relevant. Workers would support one another without needing government interference, leading to a natural decline of state power. This vision is a blend of smart insights and some wishful thinking. The genius lies in realizing that democracy should extend into the economic arena, and that political freedom is hollow without economic autonomy. Proudhon understood wage labor as a form of domination, and that workers need control over their work, not just voting rights. His federative principle, building society from the ground up through voluntary participation, offers a genuine alternative to capitalist frameworks and bureaucracies. You can see Proudhon's impact today in worker cooperatives and mutual aid groups. The cooperative movement of the late 1800s drew heavily from his ideas, but Proudhon missed the mark by not fully grasping the nature of power struggles and relying too heavily on voluntary cooperation. He assumed that capitalists would gracefully accept defeat and that the state would just fade away. Unfortunately, history tells a different story. Those in positions of power aren't quick to relinquish their control. They'll do whatever it takes, legal, illegal, upfront, behind the scenes, to maintain their standing. Worker cooperatives in capitalist structures face significant hurdles. Regular banks view their ownership model as risky, making it difficult to secure loans. Competing with capitalist businesses that shift costs onto workers and communities is a daunting task. Many successful cooperatives start to resemble typical businesses, hiring outside help and slipping back into old habits. Proudhon's key concept, the mutual bank, didn't hold up. Creating credit needs a solid base of existing wealth or state power for it to be credible. Proudhon had neither. Competing against state-backed traditional banks without amassed capital or legal support, a mutual bank couldn't transform an entire economy effectively. Furthermore, Proudhon's idea assumed a level of fairness and rationality in society that isn't always present. He believed people and organizations stick to their commitments because it's beneficial in the long run. Yet, in reality, people often focus on immediate benefits rather than future reputations. Without some enforcement or fallback mechanism, cooperatives become vulnerable to freeloaders and deceitful individuals. This is a common obstacle in anarchist frameworks, upholding agreements and maintaining order without resorting to authoritarian control. Proudhon's notion of mutual interest and reputation works somewhat in small familiar groups where everyone knows each other and future interactions are certain. In large, complex societies with transient populations and frequent impersonal exchanges, reputation holds less weight, and identifying mutual benefits becomes more challenging. Despite these setbacks, Proudhon's ideas about federative principles still pique intellectual curiosity. He was convinced that authority should start from the ground up, with larger entities existing solely to support their smaller counterparts, offering a solid critique of both state socialism and corporate capitalism. His vision of economic democracy, where workers run their workplaces through democratic co-ops, actually predicts later concepts of industrial democracy and participatory economics. The idea that relationships should be built on voluntary agreements rather than forced hierarchies continues to fuel movements for decentralization and direct democracy. From the Paris Commune to Spanish anarchism and today's platform co-ops, efforts at federative organization keep appearing because the core idea is powerful. People can work together voluntarily towards shared goals without submitting to autocratic control. What Proudhon didn't provide was not a lack of vision, but rather a practical guide for transitioning from the current state to his ideal. The real challenge is creating a federative society in a world centered around state and capital that would fiercely resist such changes due to its significant influence. This lack of practical strategy would become a key issue in future struggles. Part 4. The Big Showdown with Marx. Few intellectual battles have been as influential as the one between Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Karl Marx. Their disagreements went beyond just personal grudges, though those played a part, and exposed a significant split within the socialist movement. This divide emphasized two contrasting ways of addressing and understanding capitalism, drawing a line between anarchism and Marxism that has lasted over 150 years. It all started with mutual respect. Marx arrived in Paris in 1844 after being expelled from Germany over his radical writings. There, he encountered Proudhon, who was already famous for his book, What is Property?, and recognized as the top socialist thinker in France at the time. They spent hours exchanging ideas. Marx was then in the process of developing his own theories, deeply absorbing German philosophy, especially from Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach, while beginning to explore political economy from a philosophical standpoint. In his early 1845 work, The Holy Family, Marx spoke highly of Proudhon, describing his work as a scientific voice for the proletariat and considering Proudhon truly one of them, not just an outsider theorizing. Marx believed Proudhon's significant revelation was the push to do away with private property altogether, reflecting the revolutionary ideas brewing among the working class. Here was a self-educated worker dissecting capitalism's contradictions and reaching strong conclusions independently. Despite his praise, Marx saw flaws in Proudhon's early ideas. Even in The Holy Family, Marx suggested Proudhon misunderstood the nature of wages and money, seeing them as separate rather than linked to social relations, hinting at deeper theoretical disputes ready to surface. The turning point came in 1846 and 1847. Marx was putting together a communist correspondence committee to unite European socialists under a common theoretical vision. He invited Proudhon to be part of it. In his invite, Marx laid out his vision, a disciplined group of revolutionaries challenging utopian socialism to establish scientific socialism grounded in strong theory. Proudhon's reply was polite but firm. He wasn't interested in revolution as a means for social change, viewing it as resorting to force and unpredictability. Instead, he pushed for peaceful change through workers organizing economically, avoiding political power struggles. Proudhon clearly stated their approach and goals were at odds. Shortly after this correspondence, in late 1846, Proudhon published The System of Economic Contradictions, or The Philosophy of Poverty, and asked Marx for his thoughts. Instead of helpful feedback, he got a harsh critique. Marx spent early 1847 crafting his response, launching it in July as The Poverty of Philosophy, Answer to the Philosophy of Poverty by Mr. Proudhon. He wrote it in French to make sure French workers got the message. The mocking title set an openly scornful tone. Marx's critique dismantled Proudhon's credibility on many fronts. First, he attacked Proudhon's intellectual prowess, portraying him as a sophist using fancy words to cover up flawed ideas. Marx accused him of not understanding the economists he cited, claiming others' discoveries as his own, and building complex arguments on weak foundations. Moreover, Marx criticized Proudhon's use of Hegelian dialectics, suggesting Proudhon adopted the worst of Hegel's approach while missing its revolutionary potential. Proudhon approached economic ideas like property, competition, machines, and credit as if they were endless puzzles to solve. He hunted for contradictions and tried to fix them using a dialectical method. But Marx wasn't having it. He saw this as an unrealistic and historically flawed way of thinking. According to Marx, economic ideas aren't just abstract. They mirror real social relationships that pop up in specific historical settings. Private property isn't just a logical outcome. It's there because people have historically conquered and excluded others. Wage labor shouldn't be seen as some natural concept. It's a social dynamic that arose when independent workers lost their tools for production. Marx illustrated his point with examples, showcasing how Proudhon treated labor as if its value were fixed, proposing that goods should trade based on equal work time, thinking this would eliminate exploitation. Marx argued that capitalism transforms labor into a commodity, where workers sell their labor power for wages, and its value depends on what a worker needs to survive. This labor power generates more value for the capitalist than its cost, creating profit. Proudhon missed this key bit. He didn't distinguish between labor and labor power. His idea of fair exchanges didn't solve exploitation because it ignored the fact that workers were forced to sell their labor power due to lacking production means. Marx critiqued Proudhon's economic thoughts as conservative at heart, despite their radical front. Proudhon wanted to keep the perks of capitalism while ditching the bad parts, aiming for markets without profit and individual producers within a collective framework. Marx found this unrealistic, stating the positive and negative sides of capitalism are entwined. Competition might drive innovation, but also leads to wealth concentration and workers' suffering. These aren't easily separated. Private property may spark individual ambition, but simultaneously permits exploitation, creating a tricky situation. Proudhon's attempt to blend the good and cut out the bad was, according to Marx, muddled. Politically, Marx had bones to pick with Proudhon too. Proudhon opposed political action, believing workers should stick to economic organizations and leave the state alone. Marx saw this as a recipe for maintaining powerlessness. The ruling class wields government power to stay on top. Workers can't just construct alternatives and ignore politics. They must actively challenge and overthrow the current system. Marx specifically slammed Proudhon's view on strikes, where Proudhon thought they were pointless, since wage increases would just spike prices. Marx argued that this overlooked the true class struggle. Strikes aren't merely about paychecks. They help workers come together, build unity, and develop class consciousness. By fighting against employers, workers learn to act collectively and spot shared objectives. By opposing strikes and political activity, Proudhon was essentially advising workers to tolerate exploitation while slowly building cooperatives and mutual banks. Meanwhile, capitalists wouldn't just sit by. They'd squash these efforts by any means necessary. The notion of peaceful change was a total fantasy. If revolution was to happen, the capitalist class needed to be confronted and defeated. Now, let's get real about Marx's tone and fairness in his critiques. The Poverty of Philosophy wasn't some neutral academic piece. It was a fierce takedown designed to damage Proudhon's reputation and influence. Marx twisted Proudhon's words, pulled quotes out of context, and assigned him ideas he never supported. The book was a powerful weapon, but fairness took a back seat. Marx wasn't just driven by intellectual disagreements. He envied Proudhon's sway over French workers, a popularity Marx wanted for himself and his Communist Correspondence Committee. He was also irked because Proudhon snubbed his invitation to join that group. Some signs suggest Marx's hostility towards Proudhon was fueled by his dislike of Karl Grun, a German socialist translating Proudhon's work, whom Proudhon supported. Scholars like historian Edmund Wilson speculate that the Poverty of Philosophy was more about personal vendettas and asserting dominance than a bona fide clash over theories. The fierce nature of the attack suggested that both wounded pride and intellectual certainty were at play. Yet, Marx's personal grievances don't negate the validity of some of his critiques, which often had substance. Proudhon had a habit of dealing with economic ideas too abstractly, overlooking the actual social interactions they represented. He didn't develop a firm theory on how value is determined or how exploitation functions under capitalism. His labor-time theory of value was confusing, and his idea of achieving peaceful change through mutual credit was unrealistic. The attack from Marx hit Proudhon hard. In notes he jotted down in a copy of The Poverty of Philosophy, he vented his frustration, saying Marx should get his facts straight before ridiculing others. However, Proudhon never offered a formal counter-argument. He felt misrepresented by Marx, but maybe also understood that some criticisms had merit. The falling out between Marx and Proudhon symbolized a bigger split within the socialist movement. It was about two fundamentally different strategies for understanding and fighting capitalism. Marx's strategy relied on historical materialism, class struggles, the revolutionary overturning of the capitalist state, and temporary proletarian rule leading to communism. Proudhon, on the other hand, emphasized mutualism, federalism, rejecting political authority, peaceful change through economic organization, and immediate adoption of anarchist principles. This divide was deeply rooted in the First International Working Men's Association, which kicked off in 1864. Although Proudhon passed away in 1865, his followers, especially Mikhail Bakunin, who continued Proudhon's ideas, kept anarchism alive within the International. The disagreement between Marxists and anarchists over strategy, organization, and ultimate goals eventually tore the International apart in the early 1870s. This Marxist-anarchist rift shaped socialist politics for many years afterward. In the 20th century, communist parties inspired by Marx's theories established regimes they labeled socialist, but anarchists saw them as state capitalist tyrannies. Anarchists, drawing on Proudhon's federalist ideas, created revolutionary communities in Spain during the Civil War and sparked various self-managing movements worldwide. The two camps remained in conflict, each accusing the other of socialism's failures. Today, historians and political theorists wonder if this split was unavoidable, or if Marx and Proudhon could have found some common ground. They shared similar criticisms of capitalism, recognizing exploitation and alienation, and both aimed for workers' control over production, envisioning a classless society. Their main differences were in strategy, historical analysis versus dialectical idealism, revolutionary takeovers versus peaceful federative change. Some scholars assert Marx nailed the criticisms but was off with his solutions, suggesting that while Proudhon's particular solutions had flaws, his federalist vision might be more dependable than Marx's belief in proletarian rule. Some people argue Proudhon's ideas were more proto-science, while Marx's historical materialism pushed the understanding of social change forward. Whatever side of the debate you find yourself on, it's clear their clash weakened both ideologies. Marxism managed to provide rich economic and historical insights, but often backed authoritarian approaches, claiming they were essential for revolution. Anarchism, however, stuck to the ideal of immediate freedom and organizing through federations, yet struggled with effective strategies to enact change against powerful resistance. If Marx's analytical prowess and Proudhon's federative ideas had been merged, it could have resulted in a more effective revolutionary theory. Unfortunately, personal clashes and political differences prevented such a fusion from taking place. Part 5. A Non-Violent Revolution. Proudhon held a bold belief that stirred up plenty of debates. Social revolution should happen without violence or warfare. This idea didn't gel with many people, including Marxists and numerous other revolutionary thinkers. Understanding why Proudhon had this perspective and how it shaped his political game plan offers us a look into both the strengths and weaknesses of his ideas. Back in the 1800s, many revolutionaries saw the violent overthrow of the current system as not just needed, but unavoidable. The French Revolution set a high standard, with huge crowds rising up, storming the Bastille, taking down aristocrats, and clashing with royal forces. Revolts in 1830 and 1848 only made the idea of revolution as a battle even stronger. But Proudhon didn't follow this path. His resistance to revolutionary violence wasn't due to pacifism or any moral hesitation. He was very aware of the system's cruelty. His standpoint was more strategic, focusing on what violence actually accomplishes. To Proudhon, violence didn't lead to justice, but merely swapped one form of oppression for another. An uprising could topple a government, sure, but it wouldn't magically reform social or economic structures. The French Revolution got rid of the monarchy, yet it didn't stop exploitation. It just replaced feudal lords with capitalist business owners. Seizing state power didn't fix the core issue because state power itself was the problem. Moreover, violence often paves the way to authoritarianism. Movements relying on violence need strict organization, resembling armies with hierarchies, discipline, and a top-down approach in decision-making. When these groups succeed, the authoritarian habits stick. The revolutionary leaders then become a new ruling class, using the state they took over to push their agendas. Proudhon saw this clearly in France's revolutionary history. The Jacobins, the revolution's most fanatical group, set up a dictatorial regime under the Committee of Public Safety, executing not only aristocrats, but also rival revolutionaries and anyone they labeled an enemy of the Republic. The terror they justified as protecting the revolution turned into its own form of oppression. Napoleon's rise from the revolution's chaos led to an empire even more dictatorial than the monarchy it ended. For Proudhon, the process shapes the result. You can't forge freedom with authoritarian methods, achieve justice through injustice, or build cooperation on the foundations of coercion. A violent revolution would only breed a violent society. A revolution built on hierarchies would create a hierarchical society. So, what did Proudhon suggest instead? His idea of a social revolution focused on transforming economic relationships rather than grabbing political power. He envisioned workers uniting in cooperatives, creating mutual banks, and forming networks of independent communes. Through these initiatives, the new systems would evolve within the old society, eventually crowding out capitalistic structures and rendering the state obsolete. This approach aimed to revolutionize the way society produces, distributes, and interacts, but peacefully, through voluntary collaboration and economic independence, rather than war. Proudhon called this mutualist reorganization, believing workers shouldn't wait for state permission or a pivotal revolutionary moment. They should start building alternative setups immediately. Every cooperative founded, every mutual insurance plan created, every local network organized was a step toward a fresh social order. As these reforms gained traction and demonstrated superiority, more individuals would join in. The capitalist framework would shrink, and the state would lose its footing. It's crucial to note how Proudhon implemented these ideas during the historic events of 1848. In February of that year, another revolt in Paris toppled the monarchy and led to the establishment of the Second Republic. Despite usually steering clear of politics, Proudhon was elected to the Constituent Assembly in June. It might seem a bit strange, but Proudhon believed that, as an anarchist, joining Parliament could help him influence change from within. Unfortunately, being there didn't turn out as he'd hoped. He was surrounded by bourgeois politicians who only pretended to care about the working class when it benefited their own political goals. When Proudhon tossed around ideas like creating a national bank to provide producers with credit, his fellow representatives dismissed him as a radical threat. On a larger scale, Proudhon felt the 1848 revolution was doomed to fail because it didn't have a solid theoretical foundation. Sure, workers had risen up out of necessity and anger, but they lacked a clear vision for the future society they were aiming for. The so-called leaders, including liberal Republicans and utopian socialists, only offered lofty ideals or impractical plans. During this era, Proudhon edited several newspapers to promote his ideas. He started with the Representative of the People in February 1848 and moved on to 3 other publications, each being shut down by censorship in turn. Through these papers, he stressed that the revolution had to focus on economic change rather than just political fixes, and that workers should organize independently instead of relying on politicians. One of his bold moves was trying to establish the Bank of the People in early 1849. He viewed it as key to peaceful revolution, providing interest-free loans to help workers start co-ops and access essential resources. Proudhon encouraged workers to contribute whatever they could to build this new financial system. The bank gained some attention and a few donations, which allowed Proudhon to set up an office and start planning. But trouble soon surfaced. Many workers didn't have the financial means to significantly contribute, and wealthier individuals weren't motivated to support something that threatened their economic dominance. The state wasn't neutral either. It actively disrupted the project. By March 1849, After being convicted of seditious libel for criticizing new President Louis Napoleon, Proudhon was sentenced to 3 years in prison, beginning his term in June. To prevent government takeover, Proudhon shut down the Bank of the People before going to jail. The project only lasted a few months, never managing to issue loans, ending before it could demonstrate whether mutual credit could work, as he envisioned. While imprisoned, Proudhon continued writing, sharing his insights on the 1848 revolution in Confessions of a Revolutionary, and still contributing to newspapers from behind bars. His prison conditions weren't terrible, as he had access to books, writing materials, and visitors. Yet, this experience deepened his understanding of state power and reinforced his anarchist beliefs. The failure of the Bank of the People and the broader collapse of the 1848 revolution posed significant questions about Proudhon's strategy. If peaceful change through economic transformation was feasible, why didn't it succeed? If workers could build viable alternatives, why weren't they doing it? If the state would dissolve as economic power shifted, why did it remain strong enough to incarcerate revolutionaries and quash their projects? Proudhon never fully addressed these questions. He often blamed failures on workers not grasping mutualist ideas or lacking organization and resources. He believed that if they were better prepared, the venture might have worked. Despite mounting evidence, he clung to his belief in peaceful change. Critics, particularly Marxists, argued that Proudhon's shortcomings revealed the necessity of revolutionary violence, as the capitalist class and the state wouldn't relinquish power without a struggle. If workers couldn't stand up for themselves with force and grab control of the government to protect their revolution, any attempt to create something new would just be crushed. Dreaming of a peaceful shift of power was more like an illusion, pushing off the inevitable fight and leaving workers unprepared. But those supporting Proudhon argued that violent uprisings often didn't end in real freedom, only swapping one form of oppression for another. You had the terror of the French Revolution, the controlling changes in revolutionary movements, and Napoleon's climb to power, which all showed that even if force led to a win, it often sidetracked the revolution's true aims. Maybe Proudhon was onto something with the idea that how you achieve your goals shapes them, even if his softer approach didn't always hit the mark. This debate about whether peaceful or violent methods are more likely to miss the target still holds a major place in revolutionary thought. History later showed both viewpoints had some truth. Violent communist revolts managed to seize control, but they formed strict regimes that didn't quite deliver the classless utopias they promised. On the flip side, peaceful reforms improved workers' lives to an extent, but didn't fundamentally change the capitalist system. Anarchist groups, taking a leaf out of Proudhon's book on decentralized organization, but willing to fight, like the Spanish anarchists during the 1930s Civil War, highlighted how complicated this all was. In revolutionary Catalonia, they tried to put Proudhon's ideas of worker-run production and federated systems into action, but clashed with fascist forces. In the end, their revolution was crushed, and whether it was because they didn't use enough force or because their use of force led to big resistance is still up for discussion. Proudhon's call for peaceful change did underline the importance of starting to build a new society right here and now instead of waiting for some imagined future revolution. If you want a free, cooperative society, start setting up those kinds of institutions today. Don't delay until after the upheaval to create them. Build them as part of transforming society. This idea that new social structures should develop within the old ones, and that revolutionary actions should mirror revolutionary goals, has influenced groups from anarcho-syndicalists to today's anti-authoritarian organizers. It stands out as Proudhon's most lasting strategy, even if his hope for achieving this without conflict might have been a bit over the top. Part 6. Spotting Proudhon's missteps. It's hard to talk about Proudhon's philosophy without pointing out where he slipped up. And trust me, there were plenty of those moments. Sometimes his ideas fell apart because they were too high concept. Other times, they just didn't pan out when faced with the real world. Plus, he struggled to ground big ideas into everyday life. Spotting Proudhon's goofs is just as important as applauding his wins. Let's dig into his economic theory, especially the labor theory of value. Proudhon thought a product's worth should line up with the labor time needed to make it, with trades mirroring equal labor time. It sounds simple and fair, but it crashes into the harsh reality of economics. The fact is, different types of labor have varying productivity levels. An hour of work from a skilled engineer delivers more value than an hour from an unskilled worker because of differences in skill, training, and ability. Using advanced machines for an hour produces more than sticking with primitive tools, and making something in high demand isn't the same as making something nobody wants. Proudhon noticed these differences, but he couldn't effectively integrate them into his theory. He vaguely proposed adjusting labor time based on skill or social value, but never gave a real method to calculate these tweaks. I mean, who decides if engineering labor should be worth double or 10 times more than basic labor? If you rely on market prices, aren't you slipping back into capitalism? And if you lean on social consensus, that means needing some authority to gather those opinions. Marx's critique on this was particularly effective. He pointed out that in capitalism, labor becomes a commodity with its price set by supply and demand, just like other goods. Workers sell their ability to work for wages that cover basic living expenses. However, the labor power bought by capitalists can create more value than it costs to maintain. A worker might create 8 hours worth of value, but only need 4 hours worth to get by. The extra value, surplus value, ends up as profit for the capitalist. That's exploitation. It doesn't arise from trades being unfairly measured by labor time, but because workers have no choice but to sell their labor to begin with. Proudhon missed this point by not distinguishing between labor itself and the ability to work. He saw labor as having an inherent value rather than as a social interaction, which left him unable to see how exploitation really works in capitalism. His concept of equal trade based on labor time couldn't eliminate exploitation because it overlooked the core issue, workers being separated from the means of production. These same problems showed up in his mutual credit system. Proudhon thought banks should give interest-free loans based on the borrower's productive potential. But how can you measure that potential before someone's produced anything? How do you determine if a new venture will succeed? Capitalist banks ask for collateral and charge interest because lending is risky. Borrowers might default, and interest compensates for that risk, while collateral offers security. A mutual bank ignoring collateral or interest would have serious issues right from the start. It would need to evaluate creditworthiness, which requires information and judgment. It would need reserves for when borrowers failed to repay and would have to compete with traditional banks that attract depositors with market rates of interest. Proudhon's efforts to create such a bank didn't stand up to these practical challenges. On a deeper level, Proudhon had this overly optimistic idea that access to credit would allow workers to start co-ops capable of outperforming capitalist firms. Yet, even with credit, co-ops face hurdles in capitalist markets. They can't easily exploit workers to push up profits like capitalist companies, and making quick decisions is harder with democracy involved because it takes time. Co-ops often face hurdles because the usual banking institutions, suppliers, and customers view their ownership setup as unusual or risky. Typically, co-ops have prospered in certain niches or with government backing, rather than as a widespread alternative to capitalism. The Mondragon cooperatives in Spain are probably the most famous example of a big co-op success, but they grew with support from Catholic social teachings and Spanish laws, which contrasts with the natural growth that Proudhon envisioned. Even though co-ops have been around for a long time, they still account for only a small portion of the world's economy. Proudhon's concept of federalism is great on paper, but it has practical issues. He didn't quite pinpoint how federations would resolve disputes, handle people who reap the benefits without pitching in, or manage large-scale projects like railroads that need a ton of planning. These projects require huge investments, uniform systems, synchronized schedules over long distances, and regular maintenance. Could a totally voluntary group of associations manage this? Proudhon insisted that federative principles could fix any coordination problem, but never explained how. Today's economies demand coordination at scales and speeds that might be beyond what independent groups can handle. Massive supply chains, energy systems, and communication networks all require some centralized direction. Relying only on market-based coordination leads to waste and chaos, as capitalism shows. However, organizing without markets or planning is equally challenging. Proudhon believed in mutual interests and reputation as enforcement tools, but this didn't hold up. In small communities where everyone knows each other, reputation carries weight and can replace legal enforcement. But in larger, more anonymous societies, it loses its power. People who act in bad faith can simply move, change identities, or operate in areas where their reputation doesn't matter. Proudhon's approach to peaceful change proved his biggest practical blind spot. He thought capitalists would step back once outcompeted, that the state wouldn't interfere with the growth of new institutions, and that workers could develop a new system within the old one, conflict-free. He was mistaken on all fronts. Those with power fight tooth and nail to keep it when threatened. They wield the law, police, military, propaganda, economic pressure, and any other tools to shut down alternatives. The state does not stand neutral. It's a mechanism of class power used against revolutionary movements, whether they turn violent or not. Proudhon's time in prison and the closing of his People's Bank highlighted this, yet he didn't entirely learn from it. Another area where Proudhon was lacking was in his dialectical method. He pointed out many contradictions in capitalism, thinking they could be solved through logical synthesis wasn't adequate. He figured finding the right principles and institutions could intellectually resolve these contradictions. But capitalism's contradictions aren't just intellectual quandaries. They're deeply tied to conflicts over material interests and power dynamics. The clash between social production and private gain continues not because nobody has thought of a thoughtful solution, but because those benefiting from private gains have the power to maintain the status quo and block alternatives. Addressing these contradictions requires altering power dynamics, not just crafting clever institutions. Proudhon also didn't fully lay out a theory of historical change. He understood that societies evolve and that feudalism turned into capitalism, but he didn't offer a structured explanation for what drives these transformations. Although Marx's historical materialism has its flaws, it provides a framework for understanding how shifts in productive forces and social relations catalyze changes in society. Proudhon didn't really have a structured plan. He mostly focused on breaking down contradictions. This left him without a clear explanation as to why people would favor mutualism, why co-ops would arise, or why mutual banks would be established, apart from assuming that folks would logically recognize these ideas as superior. But people don't always act purely based on logic, especially when power structures limit their choices. Any comprehensive theory about change needs to factor in interests, power dynamics, organization, and awareness, not just clever ideas. Proudhon's take on human nature was fairly simplistic. He said humans are both self-serving and social, but he didn't really explore how these traits interact or how different environments might emphasize one over the other. He seemed to think that in the right environment, like a mutualist group, people would naturally work together based on common interests and reciprocity. But he sort of glossed over what happens when people's interests conflict, or if the reciprocity falls apart. Today, with insights from game theory and behavioral economics, we understand that in large groups, cooperation needs some kind of formal support, not just goodwill. Cooperation thrives when there are systems to spot freeloaders, align everyone's expectations, and build trust over time. Proudhon's federalism didn't dive into these specifics. Also, he didn't really confront the transition issue. Suppose, for argument's sake, all his proposals were solid in theory. Assume mutualism was indeed better than capitalism and state socialism. How do we transition from a world dominated by the state and capital to a mutualist system? What steps do workers take? What tactics do they employ? What obstacles need overcoming? Proudhon's approach of start cooperatives and mutual banks and the old system will eventually disappear wasn't quite sufficient. It didn't account for the force existing institutions might use to crush these alternatives. It overlooked the inherent advantages that states and capital hold and overestimated workers' capacity to self-organize under adverse conditions. This doesn't mean everything in Proudhon's ideas were a letdown. His views on property as exploitation, his vision of worker-managed production, his federative ideas, and his push for creating alternatives here and now all have valuable insights that remain relevant. But it does mean that, if seen as a complete program, Proudhonism didn't quite work as a blueprint for revolutionary change. Understanding where he missed the mark isn't about tearing down Proudhon, but learning from him. Every political thinker makes errors, dreams up unrealistic ideas, and leaves some loose ends. The trick is to extract the useful bits while identifying and fixing what falls short. Proudhon's shortcomings prompt us to ask the kinds of questions any freedom-focused politics should address. How can we run complex economies without relying on markets or central control? How can we balance freedom with coordination? How can society be reshaped despite resistance from those in power? The fact that he didn't solve these questions doesn't diminish their importance. Part 7. The Dark Side. Examining Proudhon thoroughly means facing up to the less flattering parts of his beliefs and character. Aside from some misguided elements in his theories, he harbored a few seriously problematic views that didn't really match the ideals he professed to uphold. These weren't just small mistakes or outdated opinions you could easily dismiss. They were deeply ingrained prejudices that really challenged his claim of being a philosopher advocating for universal human freedom. The most alarming aspect of Proudhon's personality was his blatant anti-Semitism. After he passed away, his personal diaries came to light, revealing shockingly hateful entries. He went so far as to propose that Jews ought to be either kicked out of Europe or exterminated, calling them foes of humanity. These weren't offhand remarks. They showed a consistent bias in his writings. While understanding the context is important, it doesn't excuse it. Anti-Semitism was rampant in 19th century Europe, found not just among conservatives, but socialists and radicals too. Many socialist thinkers associated Jews with financial capitalism, viewing them as symbols of usury and exploitation. Charles Fourier, another utopian socialist Proudhon admired, shared similar biases. Even Karl Marx, who was of Jewish descent, wrote essays tinged with anti-Semitism. However, Proudhon's bigotry went beyond the common prejudices of his time. His calls for extermination were so extreme that many from his era would have found them appalling. There's no underlying philosophical basis for such hatred in his ideas. It was simply raw prejudice that went against his own principles of human dignity and mutual respect. The impact of this mindset is evident in history. By the early 1900s, some right-wing nationalists in France tried to claim Proudhon as an intellectual precursor. The Cercle Proudhon, established in 1911, attempted to fuse his mutualism with the nationalism of Charles Maurras. Some members of this group drifted toward fascism, using Proudhon's anti-Semitism to support their views. This portrayal was misleading since Proudhon actually opposed nationalism and state control, both of which contradicted fascist values. Nonetheless, the fact that fascists could find justification in his writings highlights just how damaging his biases were. A thinker promoting human freedom can't at the same time advocate for the extermination of entire ethnic or religious groups. Proudhon's views on women were equally problematic, but in another way. He was a fierce patriarch who believed in a strict family structure with men at the helm. In his expansive work on justice during the Revolution and church life, published in 1858, he strongly defended the traditional family model with men as the supreme authority. Proudhon claimed that women were naturally inferior to men, both physically and mentally. He insisted this inferiority wasn't due to social conditioning, but was a biological truth. To him, a woman's proper role was in the home, as wives and mothers, under male authority. He regarded any attempts by women to seek equality or participate in public life as unnatural and harmful to social order. When feminists of his time challenged his ideas, Proudhon was quick to dismiss them with disdain. Flora Tristan, a socialist feminist he encountered in Paris, was a fierce advocate for women's rights and social equality. After she died, Proudhon wrote derisively about her beliefs. Later on, when anarchist Joseph Desjacques critiqued Proudhon's patriarchal views and urged him to oppose the oppression of women, Proudhon simply ignored him. Desjacques even pointed out that Proudhon couldn't truly call himself an anarchist if he refused to fight against male dominance over women, a harsh critique that exposed a major flaw in Proudhon's philosophy. How could someone who claimed to oppose all forms of domination and hierarchy still strongly support male dominance over women? How could someone who advocated mutual respect and voluntary association demand enforced female submission in the family? Proudhon never resolved this contradiction because he never acknowledged it as one. He honestly believed that gender inequality was just the way things were meant to be, so he didn't see it as unfair domination. But come on, that logic is flawed. It's obvious that any kind of domination isn't right. If human dignity insists on freedom and equality, then those ideas must apply to everyone. Otherwise, they mean nothing. You can't pick and choose who gets freedom based on gender. Modern anarchists and socialist thinkers have completely rejected Proudhon's outdated gender views, saying they clash with anarchist principles. The anarchist community today fully supports gender equality and has developed deep insights into how patriarchy interacts with capitalism and state power to maintain domination. This shift meant moving past Proudhon's old-fashioned views on gender while still valuing his thoughts on economics and politics. Some folks defending Proudhon try to tone down these issues by suggesting we separate his useful ideas from his personal hang-ups. They point out that we can accept his views on federalism, critiques of property, and worker self-management without endorsing his anti-Semitic or sexist beliefs. There's some truth to that. You can separate a thinker's ideas from the rest of their persona. But we must also consider if these biases were actually apart from Proudhon's core philosophy, or if they indicate broader problems in his thinking. His gender views weren't just a personal quirk, but were significant in shaping his work. These opinions were tied with his idea of the family as society's cornerstone and his justice theory that was rooted in family roles. It's telling that Proudhon could talk about equality and mutual respect, yet support women's subjugation, highlighting that his principles weren't as firm or consistent as he professed. This implies a level of self-deception and rationalization, urging us to question what else in his thinking might be skewed. Additionally, Proudhon's biases shaped his political moves and influence. His dismissive stance on women limited the appeal of his ideas and discouraged potential supporters. His anti-Semitism, though possibly resonating with certain worker prejudices, only fueled the very scapegoating and division the workers' movement should have resisted. Among influential political thinkers, few were impeccable individuals. Marx could be arrogant and spiteful. Bakunin had instances of dishonesty and conspiracy, and even Kropotkin had his own blind spots. But acknowledging everyone's flaws isn't an excuse to downplay serious moral failings. Proudhon's anti-Semitism and misogyny weren't just personal quirks. They were views he actively supported and spread. For those exploring Proudhon today, this poses a big dilemma. How do you navigate a thinker whose insights could be valuable yet held terribly prejudiced views? Simply dismissing or ignoring his biases isn't the answer. It would be both intellectually dishonest and morally wrong. However, discarding all his work due to his flaws would mean missing out on potentially valuable insights. A more balanced approach is to engage critically, embrace what's valuable, and openly reject what's harmful. Recognize his critique of property and ideas on federative organization as insightful, while noting that his views on women and Jews were not just morally wrong, but philosophically inconsistent with his own principles. Use his failures as a cautionary tale about how prejudice can tarnish even the most radical political ideas. This also underlines the limits of abstract principles on their own. Proudhon might have beautifully talked about justice, equality, and mutual respect, but these principles fall flat if not consistently applied to everyone. Every tyrant has claimed to support justice while denying it to groups they deem inferior or threatening. True dedication to human freedom shines when it's universally extended, without excluding anyone. Proudhon didn't succeed at this, and it showed. He's got some truly brilliant thoughts, but they're tangled up with some harmful ones too. When you talk about his work, it's crucial to sift through and separate the valuable insights from the not-so-great stuff. You have to watch out for your biases or the temptation to bend universal principles just because it's easier or suits your personal preferences. This is exactly the trap that leads to the kind of animosity that Proudhon encouraged. Part 8. Legacy and Evolution. Even though Proudhon had his flaws and his theories weren't perfect, his ideas greatly influenced radical movements for many years after he passed away. People remember him in different ways because various groups ran with bits of his thinking and turned them into something he might not have expected or liked. When he died in January 1865 at the age of 56, he had lived a tough life filled with poverty, prison stints, and being away from home. He left behind an impressive collection of more than 40 books, articles, letters, and notebooks. Both workers and thinkers saw him as a beacon, inspiring them to imagine a society without government control and capitalist abuse. A Russian revolutionary, Mikhail Bakunin, became a major player in carrying on Proudhon's legacy, morphing it into something new. He became the other key figure in anarchism alongside Proudhon. Bakunin met him in Paris during the 1840s and was captivated by his vision of anarchism. Yet, Bakunin and Proudhon had their differences. Proudhon was a careful thinker who stayed away from violent uprisings, while Bakunin embraced fiery rebellion and wasn't afraid of armed struggle. He took Proudhon's denial of the state and his ideas about organization seriously, believing that society should build from the base up with voluntary groups instead of top-down control from a central authority. Like Proudhon, Bakunin was critical of state socialism, arguing that Marx's idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat would just swap one form of tyranny for another, with party leaders simply replacing the capitalists. But when it came to economics, Bakunin moved away from Proudhon's mutualism. While Proudhon promoted individual ownership and mutual trade, Bakunin leaned towards collectivism, advocating that land and production resources be collectively owned by workers' organizations instead of individuals. He brushed off Proudhon's concepts of labor exchanges and mutual credit as too individual-centered and not practical. Most importantly, Bakunin supported revolutionary violence, which Proudhon strongly opposed. Bakunin believed that only through uprising could the state and capitalism be overthrown, that workers should be prepared to battle, and that revolution needed secret groups to strategize and act, which went against Proudhon's peaceful, slow change approach. The contrast between Proudhon and Bakunin signaled a major shift in anarchist thought, moving from its original mutualist roots to more revolutionary branches. After Proudhon's passing, his followers in the First International Working Men's Association, notably the French and Belgian members, started adopting a more aggressive stance under Bakunin's sway. The Paris Commune of 1871 provided a critical test for these ideas. When workers took over Paris and attempted to create a new government, many of the Commune leaders were inspired by Proudhon's ideas on federalism and worker self-management. They established cooperatives, linked neighborhoods, and experimented with direct democracy. However, facing a crackdown from the French government required a militarized response and centralized decision-making, which clashed with pure federalism ideas. The Commune's fall after 2 months, with thousands of workers killed, provided ammunition for both Marxists and anarchists. Marx claimed it showed why seizing state power was crucial to defeat the bourgeoisie, while Bakunin and the anarchists saw it as proof that workers' self-organization was powerful and that state power was useless for true freedom endeavors. These lessons influenced how later movements understood the relationship between revolutions and state authority. Once the First International split in 1872, with Bakunin's anarchists facing off against Marx's authoritarian socialists, anarchist movements started branching off in various directions. Collectivist anarchism, shaped by Bakunin and his pals, like James Guillaume, revolved around the idea of collectively owned property while maintaining a federative setup and using direct action. Anarcho-communism, on the other hand, was primarily developed by Peter Kropotkin from the 1870s onwards, and it took things further by rejecting personal ownership entirely. Kropotkin argued that in a free society, resources should be distributed according to need rather than work contribution. The slogan, "From each according to ability to each according to need," captured the core goal of anarcho-communists. This marked a significant shift from Proudhon's idea of fair labor exchange based on hours worked. However, Kropotkin still took a lot from Proudhon's ideas about federalism and critiquing state power. His idea of free communes voluntarily joining together for mutual aid resonated with Proudhon's thinking, even as Kropotkin embraced a communist economic vision that Proudhon didn't favor. This shows how later anarchists adopted some ideas from Proudhon while discarding others. Anarcho-syndicalism, emerging in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, introduced another twist to Proudhon's ideas. Syndicalists organized workers into revolutionary unions that not only fought for better conditions, but also aimed to take over industries through general strikes. Their vision of workplaces run by worker federations echoed Proudhon's labor associations and his federative approach. The Spanish anarchists who applied this concept during the Civil War of 1936-39 made the largest attempt to realize Proudhonian principles. In revolutionary Catalonia, workers seized control of factories and farms, forming collectives and managing production through federations. For a while, millions lived under a system similar to Proudhon's vision, self-managed by workers without government control or capitalist ownership. However, coordinating the collectives was challenging, with some succeeding more than others, and the pressures of war leaned towards centralization. Eventually, the revolution crumbled due to a combination of military defeat by fascists and internal sabotage by communists within the Republican faction. Despite these challenges, the Spanish example showed that Proudhonian federalism could operate on a large scale. Individualist anarchism, particularly as developed in the U.S. by Benjamin Tucker and others leaned heavily on Proudhon's mutualism. Tucker translated Proudhon's works and supported mutual banking and labor exchange systems. American individualist anarchists championed free markets without capitalism, arguing that once monopolies were dismantled and credit became more accessible through mutual banks, fair exchanges among independent producers would take root. This tradition has a complicated history. Some modern libertarians who embrace free markets and oppose state power claim roots in Proudhon and Tucker, though many have abandoned the anti-capitalism that was central to their beliefs. Genuine left-wing market anarchism, which combines market principles with an opposition to capitalist property, remains a smaller faction, but directly traces its roots to Proudhon. Proudhon's influence extended beyond those who identified as anarchists. His critique of centralized state socialism resonated across various libertarian socialist branches, such as council communists, who emphasized workers' councils over party rule, autonomous Marxists who rejected Leninist leadership, and diverse, anti-authoritarian socialist groups that drew inspiration from Proudhon's arguments. Even some significant political developments bear traces of Proudhonian thought. The cooperative movement that spread across Europe in the late 19th century, creating consumer and producer cooperatives along with mutual insurance societies, was directly inspired by Proudhon's mutualism. Credit unions, which are nonprofit and member-owned, fulfilled parts of his vision for mutual banking. While federalism, as a political idea, often wound up within state structures rather than replacing them entirely, it still drew from Proudhon's concepts. Proudhon's ideas on spreading power across independent groups that voluntarily work together had a big influence on many federal and decentralized projects. By the time the 20th century rolled around, his direct impact waned as anarchist movements were crushed by fascist and communist regimes, and as social democracy and revolutionary Marxism became the leading strands of socialism. Yet, his concepts never fully disappeared. During the 1960s, the New Left, with its interest in participatory democracy and decentralization, unknowingly echoed Proudhonian themes. Nowadays, movements against globalization, autonomous politics, and various forms of direct democracy activism often function using principles akin to Proudhon's. They focus on horizontal organization, consensus-based decision-making, choosing direct action over electoral avenues, and building alternative institutions in the present rather than waiting for some revolutionary change. All these ideas are tied to Proudhon's federalist viewpoint and his strategy of nurturing the new within existing systems. Worker cooperatives still exist, and new ones keep popping up, although they account for only a tiny fraction of the global economy. Platform cooperatives, which adapt cooperative ideals to digital services, represent a contemporary attempt to bring Proudhon's ideas into the tech world. The mutual aid networks that saw growth during the pandemic and similar crises embody the mutual support concept Proudhon championed. The inconsistencies in his influence reflect the inconsistencies in his thinking. While his federalism inspired genuine revolutionary movements, his mutualism pointed to gradual reform through economic rivalry. His anarchism was fundamentally against all forms of authority, yet he endorsed male authority in family matters due to his patriarchal attitudes. Though he was broadly anti-nationalist, his prejudices also bred division. Diverse movements drew varied inspirations, focusing on parts of his teachings while ignoring or rejecting others. The lasting aspects of his legacy aren't necessarily tied to his economic suggestions, which were often impractical, but rather his key insights on power and organization endure. Ideas like consistently questioning authority, developing social systems from the grassroots rather than from the top, and ensuring workers have control over their labor instead of being under the thumb of bosses or bureaucrats still resonate today, despite adjustments or dismissals of his original methods. Proudhon's legacy isn't a fixed set of teachings. It's a living tradition of critical thinking and a process of trial and error. Every new group of thinkers revisits his ideas, holding on to what's valuable and discarding or reshaping what isn't. This ongoing transformation and adaptability might be the most Proudhonian aspect of his legacy, an unwavering challenge to every form of authority, his own included. Part 9. Academic Debates and Modern Critiques. The discussions around Proudhon have been quite a mixed bunch, stirring debates from his time right up to ours. Experts from various fields like political theory, economics, history, and philosophy have argued about his influence, seen his ideas in different ways, and couldn't settle on whether his ideas were helpful or harmful. Often, these debates reflect as much about the scholars and their political views as they do about Proudhon himself. Originally, the first scholarly reactions were driven by the ideological battles of the 19th century socialist movement. Marxists, echoing Marx's own stern criticisms, dismissed Proudhon as a confused middle-class idealist. They viewed his mutualism as a nostalgic desire for old-time artisanal production instead of promoting a revolutionary future. They claimed his misunderstanding of capitalism's true nature and his dismissal of class struggle made him more of a hindrance than a help to the workers' cause. On the other hand, anarchist thinkers praised Proudhon as a visionary who foresaw the pitfalls of centralized socialism long before the harsh truths of Stalinism came to light. They valued his federalism and his commitment to implementing libertarian principles immediately rather than waiting for a revolution, considering it a major theoretical advancement. While his mutualist economics had its downsides, his political philosophy offered profound insights into power and organization. Historians from the early 20th century often labeled Proudhon as a go-between figure, useful for understanding the progression of socialist ideas, but overshadowed by more developed theories that followed. George Woodcock's significant 1962 work, Anarchism, placed Proudhon at the starting point of anarchist thought, yet leaned towards the notion that thinkers like Bakunin and Kropotkin took anarchist theory further beyond Proudhon's initial steps. This view became widely accepted. Proudhon was the founding father of anarchism, but not its most refined theorist. French scholars usually treated Proudhon with more seriousness than their Anglo-American peers, partly because his writings were more accessible in French and because he represented an important element of French Republican and socialist tradition. Henri de Lubac's 1948 study, The Un-Marxian Socialist, explored Proudhon's religious and philosophical musings, suggesting his work had complex theological elements often overlooked by political analysts. In the early 20th century, an attempt by French right-wing nationalists to claim Proudhon, particularly through the Cercle Proudhon, founded in 1911, sparked further scholarly debate. Some historians argued that Proudhon's anti-Semitism and certain conservative ideas made him a precursor to fascism. Israeli historian Zeev Sternhell, a fascism expert, noted that Action Française, a far-right group, considered Proudhon one of their intellectual influencers. However, anarchist scholars strongly rebutted this perspective, dismissing it as a complete misinterpretation. They pointed out that Proudhon's federalism, anti-nationalism stance, opposition to state control, and advocacy for worker self-management were fundamentally at odds with fascist ideology. The selective quotations from fascists ignored the core of his philosophy, demonstrating only their deceit, not Proudhon's real beliefs. This debate highlighted a broader issue in Proudhon's scholarship, the habit of cherry-picking from his extensive, sometimes contradictory writings to support preconceived ideas. Since Proudhon's work spanned over 25 years, covering many topics and often employing dialectic methods to explore diverse perspectives, there are snippets to back just about any interpretation if you search hard enough. Contemporary political thinker Daniel Guérin, writing in the 60s and 70s, aimed to create what he called libertarian Marxism by blending Marxist and anarchist ideas. Guérin argued that Proudhon's later works, especially those focusing on justice in the Revolution and in the Church, leaned towards conservatism, which he thought anarchists should reject. Guérin figured that blending Proudhon's ideas about federalism and anti-authoritarianism with Marx's class analysis might create a more realistic revolutionary theory. Proudhon's economic ideas haven't gone over well with economic historians. Compared to Marx, his labor theory of value is often viewed as underdeveloped. Many dismiss his ideas on mutual credit as unrealistic, since they don't account for how complex economies generate credit. He thought cooperatives could outdo capitalist companies, but history shows that cooperatives tend to struggle in capitalist markets. On the other hand, some modern economists see value in his work. David Ellerman, who focuses on workplace democracy, believes Proudhon's views on possession versus property have crucial insights that mainstream economics often overlooks. Ellerman expands on Proudhon's thoughts when discussing labor property rights and worker self-management, adding more detail to these ideas. Recently, international relations scholars have started paying attention to Proudhon's views on global order. In 2015, Alex Pritchard wrote Justice, Order, and Anarchy, which highlighted Proudhon's perspectives on war, peace, and global relations, presenting him as the pioneer in theorizing anarchist global politics. Pritchard says Proudhon's federalism didn't stop at national boundaries, but suggested a worldwide network of federated communities rather than individual nations. This renewed interest in Proudhon's global ideas has sparked debates on whether anarchist theories could offer a reasonable alternative to traditional global politics. If states aren't taken as a given and federal systems could work worldwide, that challenges conventional thought in international relations. However, critics argue that Proudhon's international federalism, like his other proposals, doesn't clarify how such a framework could come into being or survive against powerful states. Philosophers have debated Proudhon's connections to Hegel and the dialectical method, with some claiming he misunderstood Hegel and his dialectics were unclear. Others suggest that Proudhon adapted Hegelian dialectics to match his own perspective, turning it into a tool for examining actual economic problems. Some consider Proudhon's dialectics, flaws and all, as a distinct contribution, not merely a reflection of Hegel. Discussions about Proudhon's anti-Semitism and misogyny have intensified as scholars explore how these prejudices mix with his political theories. Some argue These biases don't negate his major contributions, while others believe they are too deeply entrenched, indicating significant flaws in his philosophical methods. Anarchist historian E.I.N. McKay, editor of the collection Property as Theft, talks about Proudhon's biases, but maintains that his ideas about property, federalism, and worker control still hold significance. McKay concedes that Proudhon's sexism conflicted with his anarchist beliefs, and his anti-Semitism was unethical, but insists these issues don't entirely discredit his work. This position faces criticism from those who think a more critical evaluation is needed. Current political trends have revived scholarly interest in Proudhon's ideas. With the rise of neoliberal globalization, the concentration of economic power, issues in representative democracy, and centralized state socialism losing credibility after the Soviet Union's collapse, Proudhon's views are attracting new attention. Researchers looking into worker cooperatives, platform cooperatives, participatory economics, and decentralized decision-making are returning to Proudhon's work for potentially valuable insights. While few fully endorse his specific theories, many appreciate his overall approach, particularly his skepticism toward both markets and governments, his focus on worker control, and his belief in federative organization as a potential way forward. When considering new systems, critics, however, argue that the renewed interest is more of a hopeful exercise than a serious analysis of Proudhon's actual theories and their flaws. They point out that over the last 150 years, Proudhon's ideas haven't been successful, noting that cooperatives remain marginal, mutual credit hasn't replaced traditional banking, and federal structures haven't replaced state systems. They claim Proudhon's vision has been attempted and found lacking, and that modern scholars citing him are just rehashing old mistakes. Supporters argue that Proudhon's visions never really had a fair chance in supportive environments. Worker cooperatives and mutual credit systems have always operated in hostile capitalist systems, facing inherent hurdles. Their persistence and occasional success hints at untapped potential that could thrive under different conditions. Moreover, the failures of state-controlled socialism and the ongoing issues within capitalism make exploring other possibilities all the more important. An interesting debate among scholars is whether Proudhon should be considered an anarchist by today's standards. He was the first to embrace anarchism positively, but his focus on mutualism, centered on contracts, markets, and personal ownership, contrasts sharply with Kropotkin's communism or the revolutionary syndicalism of later anarchist movements. Some say Proudhon represents a distinct school of thought called mutualist anarchism, which shouldn't be confused with social anarchism. Others argue that all these forms, mutualism, collectivism, communism, and syndicalism, are branches of the same anarchist tree, unified in their rejection of hierarchy and advocacy for self-organization. While the economic differences are significant, they are secondary to the shared commitment to federalism and challenging state authority. This debate over where Proudhon fits into anarchism mirrors broader arguments about the essence of anarchism. Interpreting Proudhon's work is no cakewalk. His massive body of work is dense, often repetitive, sometimes inconsistent, and for a long time, much of it wasn't available in English. This means many Anglo-American scholars delve into his ideas through second-hand sources, leading to potential misinterpretations. The debate over using a nomothetical or hermeneutical approach to understand Proudhon is quite revealing. Some scholars adopt a nomothetical approach, attempting to extract a consistent scientific theory from his writings by concentrating on specific texts and interpretations, discarding contradictory parts as errors or dialectical experiments. Others take a hermeneutical approach, embracing the disorder in his work, seeing contradictions as aspects to be valued rather than issues to be resolved. Deciding how to view the evolution of Proudhon's ideas over time further complicates matters. His early works, like What is Property, were more radical than his later writings, which show a more measured stance on some topics. Should we focus on the early or the later Proudhon? Different perspectives on this lead to varied assessments of his overall influence. Ultimately, reaching a consensus on Proudhon through scholarly debate seems unlikely because the issues are not just academic, they're deeply political. Whether his ideas are useful depends partly on one's own beliefs about social organization, effective strategies for change, and which problems need the most urgent attention. Scholars starting with different premises will naturally arrive at different conclusions about Proudhon's impact. What's clear is that Proudhon's ideas still resonate today because they address unresolved issues. How can we craft complex modern economies to be democratic, avoiding both capitalist markets and state control? How can we distribute power to deter tyranny without falling into chaos? How do we balance personal freedom with the need for community cooperation? These are the types of questions Proudhon explored, and because we still haven't cracked these problems, people keep revisiting his ideas, flaws, and all. Part 10, Wrapping It Up. We've dug into Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's philosophy from all sorts of angles. His main ideas, his methods, the practical solutions he suggested, his spats with other thinkers, his hits and misses, his biases, his lasting mark, and the scholarly debates about his significance. So, what's the takeaway for this fascinating, sometimes contradictory, but undeniably influential figure? Proudhon's biggest gift to us was his radical shake-up of ideas many took for granted as just the way things were. He argued that private property was more theft than a natural right. He believed government wasn't a must for social order. It actually hindered it. To him, capitalism didn't reward workers. It took advantage of them, and progress wasn't linked to hierarchies. In fact, hierarchies slowed it down. These daring assertions rocked the very core of 19th century politics and moral thought. By declaring property is theft, Proudhon challenged everyone to rethink how ownership operated. He pointed out that legal property rights let resource-rich folks profit off those with less. Rent, profit, and interest, he argued, were ways for people to take without giving back, suggesting capitalist ownership structures were just legalized exploitation. Even those who shrug off his specific points have to grapple with the deep questions he raised about ownership's moral ground. By advocating anarchism as a positive belief, Proudhon set the stage for an entirely new political philosophy, envisioning a society without government. Before his time, anarchism was all about chaos. After him, it became about voluntary cooperation, federative systems, and order built on mutual respect, not authority. This was a groundbreaking shift that opened up the imagination to consider alternatives to government control. Proudhon's federalism was a real middle way between free markets and state command, and between individualism and collectivism. His idea of a society organized from the ground up through voluntary deals among independent groups with no central power added a fresh dimension to political theory. Whether it could ever fully take shape, it presented a new model that influenced movements and thinkers for years. His stress on worker self-management and how economic democracy is key to political democracy foresaw issues that would later become central to labor disputes across the globe. Proudhon saw wage labor as submission, believed that voting rights were empty if people spent their waking hours tightly controlled at work, and thought true freedom meant workers running their own work lives. This idea still speaks volumes in today's conversations about workplace democracy and economic justice. But Proudhon had his flaws, and they're impossible to overlook. His economic ideas were messy, and his practical plans were off. His take on the labor theory of value didn't clarify how exploitation actually played out in capitalism. His mutual credit ideas could never scale large enough to shake an economy. He was unrealistically hopeful that co-ops could beat capitalist firms without government aid or drastic change. While he sometimes nailed the contradictions in things, he often treated economic concepts too abstractly, missing how they reflected real social dynamics. This led to theoretical fixes that didn't mesh with real-world conditions or class battles. He cooked up paper solutions without a real path to making them happen. Worst of all were his bigotries, especially his anti-Semitism and disdain for women, which were both morally wrong and philosophically clashing with his claimed beliefs. A philosopher for universal dignity and mutual respect can't at the same time push for the elimination of Jews or the repression of women. These biases showed his failure to consistently apply his principles and tarnished his image as a liberatory thinker. While Proudhon's ideas shaped future movements, they often went in directions he wouldn't have wanted. Even though he was against revolutionary violence, anarchists picking up his ideas often went in that direction. He was all for personal possession over shared ownership, yet later, anarchists moved toward communism. He was all about advocating for peace, even though his federalist views faced a serious test during Spain's revolutionary civil war. His influence developed in ways he might never have anticipated. So, what does Proudhon have to offer to modern readers and movements? Not a ready-made blueprint to follow, since his specific ideas are outdated and his prejudices need to be completely discarded. He's not a perfect role model either. His personal flaws and theoretical limitations are too substantial to ignore. However, he provides something potentially much more crucial, a set of questions, insights, and challenges that still hold value in today's struggles. The challenge of shaping modern economies without succumbing to capitalist exploitation or red tape remains unsolved. Proudhon's mutualism might not provide the answer, but his belief that we need choices other than just markets and planning keeps the debate alive. Today's experiments with cooperatives, platform co-ops, participatory economics, and various kinds of economic democracy still wrestle with the same balancing act between coordination and autonomy that Proudhon highlighted. The problem of distributing power to avoid tyranny while preventing disorder still persists. Although Proudhon's federalism might not be entirely applicable, his critique of centralization and his grassroots approach provide significant insights. Current movements that push for direct democracy, horizontal structures, and shared decision-making often echo Proudhon's ideas, even if the people involved haven't heard of him. The struggle to bring about social change while confronting established powers' resistance remains unsolved. Proudhon's optimistic belief in peaceful change was naive, but his warning that revolutionary violence could lead to tyranny has been validated throughout history. The dilemma of not having enough resources versus corrupt means, which he wrestled with, remains a challenge for revolutionary movements. Possibly most importantly, Proudhon underscored the necessity of questioning all forms of authority, including examining one's own beliefs and biases. His inability to apply this principle consistently to his own biases highlights how tough it can be and how easily we ignore our blind spots. Nonetheless, the principle holds. Authority always needs to justify itself. Hierarchies should always be challenged. Established beliefs must always be questioned. For researchers, Proudhon offers a wealth of material for digging into the progression of socialist thought, the conflicts within radical movements, and the link between theory and practice. His extensive writings contain as many insights as they do mistakes, making him a prime subject for teaching critical thinking in political philosophy. Students can learn from both his fails and wins. For activists and organizers, Proudhon offers something to both inspire and caution against. His vision of a society founded on voluntary cooperation and mutual aid remains an inspiring goal. His insistence on enacting libertarian principles right away instead of waiting for some far-off revolution provides an important angle contrary to vanguardist views. Yet, his oversight of the significance of power and reliance on purely economic changes without engaging in political struggles provides essential lessons about what pitfalls to dodge. Proudhon's life and work showcase the contradictions of his era and radical thought in general. He was a genuine working-class intellectual who never forgot his life of poverty, yet he endorsed patriarchal family models that oppressed working-class women. He was a forward thinker who imagined alternatives to capitalism and state control, yet he maintained racial prejudices. He was sharp in identifying real issues in political economy, but tossed around solutions that were unworkable. These contradictions don't cancel each other out to make Proudhon just a middling thinker. Instead, they produce a legacy that warrants critical and selective engagement. We can use his ideas on property, power, and organization while rejecting his biases. We can appreciate his federalist vision while acknowledging the shortcomings of his specific strategies. We can admire his intellectual courage in challenging foundational assumptions while being cautious of his failures to consistently apply his own principles. Proudhon is a unique figure in political thought. He wasn't the most thorough thinker, that's Marx's game, and he didn't excel at implementing plans, many of which didn't go well. Plus, he had some serious flaws in the ethics department, with some ugly biases. Yet, he wasn't afraid to face questions others avoided, envision what others couldn't, and inspire movements that left a mark on history. His dream was a world where workers managed their work through democratic cooperatives, society organized through voluntary associations rather than government coercion, and property simply meant using it rather than exploiting it. Sadly, that's still not the world we live in. After more than 175 years since he passed, capitalism and state structures still dominate, with exploitation and control still rampant, and the problems he highlighted remain unresolved. Does this mean all of Proudhon's ideas flopped and were useless? It's not so cut and dry. Ideas aren't deemed successful just by immediate application. They can shift perspectives, reveal new possibilities, fuel ongoing fights, and provide analytical tools, even if they're not directly actionable. Proudhon got people to rethink property, seeing it as a societal concept ripe for change. He altered the perception of governance, showing that social order doesn't have to lean on state-enforced authority. He changed workers' perspectives on labor, laying the groundwork for ideas about workers' control, eventually feeding into cooperative movements, syndicalist efforts, and struggles for workplace democracy worldwide. His failures give us valuable lessons alongside his achievements. The failure of mutual credit illustrates how challenging it is to create new economic systems in a capitalist-driven world. His fumbled attempts at dialectical methods reveal the dangers of viewing social issues as mere logical conundrums rather than real-world clashes. The collapse of peaceful transformation shows how fiercely power structures resist any challenge. His personal flaws, his biases and blind spots also show that even the most radical thinkers can struggle to consistently live by their beliefs. Looking at Proudhon, 200 years after his era, what did he get right, and where did he trip up? He nailed the exploitative side of capitalism, the potential for private property to breed domination, and the subordination embedded in wage labor. He saw how state power often drifts toward tyranny, the risks of centralizing power, and how bureaucracy tends to serve itself rather than the public. He was on point about the need for workers to control their work, for organization to grow from the grassroots, and for freedom and equality to be pursued now, not postponed until some distant future. But he underestimated the resilience with which states and capitalists would defend their interests. He got it wrong with his economic models that didn't stand a chance against capitalist finance and industry. He fumbled with biases that clashed with his beliefs, showing flaws in his reasoning, and his trust in human nature and voluntary cooperation didn't fully acknowledge how power structures and material conditions shape behavior. For anyone wanting to learn from Proudhon today, the challenge is in keeping what's still relevant, while letting go of what didn't work or was damaging. This means digging deep, avoiding blind praise or outright rejection, carefully pulling insights from errors, principles from prejudices, dreams from delusions. Proudhon asked if we could build a different world, a world free from exploitation and control, powered by cooperation rather than coercion. His plan, mutualism and federalism through peaceful means, didn't succeed. But the urgency of his question is just as alive now as it was back then. Even if his solution didn't hold up, it doesn't mean we should abandon the question altogether. With the flaws of capitalism still causing problems and the obvious failures of state socialism, the hunt for new solutions feels even more pressing. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, though a bit of an enigma with ideas that weren't always spot on, aimed to address real issues we face. Though his thoughts enriched political discourse, his biases have definitely tarnished his legacy. His thinking ignited movements that shaped many lives, even if some of his proposals were unrealistic. At the core, he was just a person, tangled in contradictions and faced with limitations. His biggest gift might actually be his inconsistency, which keeps us from treating his ideas as gospel and pushes us to scrutinize them critically. Through both his blunders and breakthroughs, his narrow views, and his visionary ideas, Proudhon highlights the complicated task of reimagining how we organize our society. The ongoing quest to cut down on exploitation and power struggles continues, and imperfections aside, Proudhon's work still plays a role in that journey.